UN HLPF, which is to be held in New York, and the 13th IS Conference on HIV Science to be held in Rwanda. This session, which is on the theme of did the 4th International Conference on Financing for Development deliver on gender equality and feminist agenda, is co-hosted by International Conference on Family Planning, ICFP 2025, Family Planning News Network, FPNN, Global Center for Health Diplomacy and Inclusion, SEDI, International Planned Parenthood Federation, IPPF, Asian Pacific Resource and Research Center for Women, ARROW, Women's Global Network for Reproductive Rights, WGNRR, Asia Pacific Media Alliance for Health and Development, that is APCAT Media, and CNS. Before we begin, I'm happy to inform our participants that encouraged by the success of the first edition of She and Rights Media Awards, we have launched its second edition. Please do apply and spread the word around. The stakes are higher this time in consonance with your skills. A few quick housekeeping announcements before we begin. Participants, please keep yourself muted throughout the session. You can type in your queries and comments in the chat box as the session progresses. We will take up all relevant questions after all the speakers have presented. Friends, as all of us must be knowing, the 4th International Conference on Financing for Development was recently held in Seville, Spain, with the intent to reform financial architecture, in fact, to reform the international financial architecture and to address the financing challenges preventing the investment push that is needed for achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. The conference outcomes influence decisions on tax, debt, trade, aid, and public financing, which impact the lives of women, girls, young people, and all gender diverse groups. But did it achieve its objective of restructuring the global economy and financial system to benefit all equitably, including women, girls, and gender diverse people? Did it guarantee long-term, flexible, inclusive, equitable financing for development? Or did it look into women and girls as merely economic potentials for economic benefits without really addressing the fundamental barriers to gender justice, including labor rights, safeguards for corporate abuses, and preventing gender-based violence in the workplace? Let us hear from our firebrand speakers today, many of whom were present on site at FFD4. I am honored to invite Jyothirmai Racherla, Deputy Executive Director, Asian Pacific Resource and Research Center for Women, to deliver her opening address. Welcome, ma'am, and over to you.
Thank you, Shobha ji. I would like to have access to share my presentation.
Yes, I think you can. Yes, you can. Yes, we can see it.
So, hello everyone. And the question before us has been, did the 4th Financing for Development deliver? This conference, did it deliver on gender equality and the feminist agenda? In the overall, if we look at what is a feminist agenda, it is a gender transformative economic system that is based on rights, on justice, on care, on equality for everyone urgently. And this was captured in the Feminist Forum Political Declaration. And if this is what we are talking about, then the 4th International Financing for Development Conference did not deliver on gender equality and the feminist agenda. So for everyone, this conference, it was held from the 30th of June until the 3rd of July, and a lot of preparations before this conference were going on by feminist organizations, by women's organizations, CSOs. Everyone were putting in efforts in addition to the stakeholders, including member states and other institutions. So we are, given that so much of work has been done as a prior preparatory processes, also in putting into the outcome document. We had the women's major group, the feminist groups who were actually inputting into the outcome document. With all these efforts, we would have imagined that this would have been a platform for governments to reaffirm full gender equality, including sexual and reproductive health and rights, and have a firm plan to achieve the sustainable development agenda using a gender transformative financing agenda. However, the conference outcome document, it was a mix, but at the same time, it was definitely a diluted version of the vision and ambition of the Addis Ababa Action Agenda, which was the previous financing conference, and also other previous conferences such as the Monterrey and the Doha conference. It also compromised the International Conference on Population and Development, which was, again, a conference that was held in 1994, and the Beijing Platform for Action Commitments. And both these conferences that were held in 1994 and 1995, these were focused on gender equality and sexual and reproductive health and rights. So definitely there was a dilution in the ambition that we were wanting to achieve. So before we got into the main conference from the 30th June to the 3rd of July, there was this whole organizing of feminist groups. So from the 27th to the 28th of June, a feminist forum ahead of the International Conference on Financing for Development and beyond was actually held. And this feminist forum brought global feminists together who were working on this agenda, who wanted to ensure that this conference came up with a firm outcome. And in the feminist forum, there was a declaration that actually came out, and you can access this declaration. Maybe we will also share the political declaration with you later. And this political declaration, it squarely put in what were the compromises. I mean, if you look at the outcome document of this conference, it is already called a compromiso di civile. So it was a compromise because it was trying to balance the ambitions of different stakeholders. And member states did put their efforts, but at the same time, it was not meeting the requirements of our current realities. So this Feminist Forum declaration, it acknowledged and it commended this Compromiso di Civile, which is basically the outcome of the fourth financial for financing for development conference. And it also commended how, within this document, the imperative to achieving gender equality was mentioned. The empowerment of women and girls was mentioned. The economic value inherent in unpaid care work, this was also mentioned. And also there were references in the document around eradicating gender-based violence. However, again, as the feminists from this whole forum, we also raised concern that the agreed commitment did not sufficiently steer the financing architecture. I think from the beginning, the reforming of the international financing architecture was something that was what everybody asked for. And financing architecture that would realize gender just economy in which financing for development will result in equitable outcomes for all in terms of fair distribution of resources within countries and in between countries. And that would basically promote social, economic, environmental justice and strengthen democracy and multilateralism. But as we say this was not achieved. And the declaration, the feminist declaration actually then said that we will continue to monitor what this outcome is, which is basically the compromiso. But at the same time, we will continue to do our work in the future post this conference to demand for a right-based, environmentally just, decolonial, intersectional, sustainable, people-centered economic model. And that is what is a model that we require in these current times. which is centering care, which is centering reparations, which is centering redistribution and accountability. This feminist political declaration, it also called for de-escalating wars and also ending territorial invasions, genocide, and nothing less from this is acceptable, is what this feminist declaration talked about. So I'm just giving you this overview in a nutshell to say that, although some references were made saying, okay, we need to achieve gender equality, we recognize unpaid care work, and then we need to eradicate gender-based violence. However, the broader aspects and the full aspects of gender equality or sexual and reproductive health and rights were not brought in within the outcome document. And some kind of reality check is also important for all of us. I mean, in the current times that we are in, we are in a dysfunctional international financing architecture. Countries in the global south are facing the brunt of this. We are increasingly facing challenges to mobilize resources for our own development. And then because most of the countries in the global south are in the cycles of perennial debt from which they have to keep servicing to these international financial institutions. And as a result of this perennial debt cycles that our countries are in, then that results into these austerity measures. And these austerity measures include, where our countries cut down on public services, access to health services, access to education services, no social protection services. And all of this, while it impacts the general population, marginalized communities, poor people, but the impact is much higher for women and girls in all their diversity across the strata. And the current, financing architecture that we have, we also see that data is telling us that developing countries are seeing a record high debt servicing costs in 2023, and this is actually straining low and middle income economies. And then while this is happening, we are all trying to commit ourselves to ensuring that the sustainable development agenda, the global goals for sustainable development agenda, which are the 17 goals, which need to be implemented. And we are all racing in order to implement the SDG agenda. But to implement that in the next 4 years, there is a 4 trillion USD annual investment gap. So where is this money going to come from when, many of, when our member states, when our financial institutions, when donor countries are stepping back to investing? In 2024, we have also seen that the official development assistance coming from the DAC member countries, who are basically the donor countries, this has declined by 7.1% in real terms. And this is the first drop in 5 years. And, if you generally look at 0.7% GNI is the ODA agreement. But then at this point in time, across combining all the donor countries, we see an investment of only 0.33%. And we are seeing a further decline. And while these resources are again, we are not having, the global South countries are facing these resources gaps. Again, the global South is also in an age of polycrisis. There are so many challenges that we face, climate crisis being one. And if we consider the Asia and the Pacific region, 40% of the global natural disaster events really take place, in this region, because we have 60% of the population living in this Asia Pacific region. And this further exacerbates the cycles of gender inequality, whether it is unpaid domestic work, whether it is because in times of climate crisis, women have to invest more hours in care. What also happens is, your education institutions close, the public services, the health institutions close. So in the context of disasters, then health, education, and all these social protection services, they come to a halt. So these are some of the impacts that we are talking. I mean, at this point in time, poverty reduction is also at a standstill. 9% of people worldwide are in extreme poverty in 2022. The social protection coverage, while it has reached a milestone for covering half of the world's population, but then, low income countries are showing no improvement in social protection. And then, the poorest countries are always left behind. The other impact of this in terms of gender equality, I mean, we have not much improvements around gender equality. And then, whether it comes to health outcomes, maternal mortality is stagnant since 2015, maternal mortality reduction. So again, this is something which talks about how the lack of investments in the health sector is resulting in poorer health outcomes. So there is this whole correlation. When there are poor social investments in the social sector, then it doesn't contribute to the economic sector. But that logic is something that member states, everyone misses, and they think that, okay, we need to get these economic returns. But you invest in the social sector, you will of course get returns in the economic arena as well. The other thing that we also see is in this region, we have high out-of-pocket expenses. So you see this whole poverty from the micro to the macro, like, at a household level, the out-of-pocket expenses are so high for women. And then if the out-of-pocket expenses are high, which means that women, girls are not, considered to access health services. And then the health systems, education systems are dysfunctional. Again, at the global level, and then our own member states, I mean, in our own countries, there are very less public health, expenditures, whether it is public health or education expenditures. These are very less. Domestic resource mobilization for the public health sector, whether social protection, health, education, is again less. And then at the same time, we globally, countries are in debt distress, and also the ODA is the overseas development assistance, or the official development assistance is not there. So, at different levels, this is going to impact on gender equality and sexual and reproductive health and rights. And that's the very reason why we are calling for a reform of the international financial architecture, which basically the fourth international conference did not deliver. In the outcome document, we had not even seen one mention of sexual and reproductive health and rights. So moving forward, okay, we have this compromise. And then moving forward, some of the, advocacy calls in the feminist political declaration, they are calling for funding and resourcing genuine multi-stakeholder feminist platforms and partnerships with women's civil society, especially from the global south, so that we are reviewing and monitoring the FFD mechanism and the outcomes. And the leadership of civil society is important. And we are asking, our advocacy ask is to ensure civil society leadership, our engagement in these processes. We are also asking for eliminating all economic policy conditionalities that are attached to aid, that promote austerity, privatization, and deregulation. We don't want conditionality when it comes to loans. And in the first place, there should not be loans, there should be grants. And then again, as we are all saying, the financial architecture, it really needs to be reformed so that it can guarantee long-term, flexible, inclusive, equitable financing for development. And that's why the whole restructuring of the global economic governance needs to take place. Currently, it is very north heavy. We need to have global south parity as well in this. We need to include democratization of the decision making across the international financial institutions and the multilateral development banks. And these are the reforms that we are asking for, where the voting systems also include the lower and middle income and developing countries. So I will stop here. So that was my response to the whole financing for development conference outcomes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sai. Thank you for drawing such a clear picture of the world we live in today and that nasty global north and global south divide, which seems to be increasing rather than decreasing. And let us hope that the asks of the feminist forums and the feminist groups really sees the light of the day and some sanity dawns upon in the minds of people who are really framing the global financial architecture. Thank you very much for that. Our next speaker is Lidy Nacpil, Coordinator, Asian People's Movement on Debt and Development. Welcome, Lidy. The stage is yours now.
Hello, everyone. I'm very honored to be invited to your webinar and to lend my thoughts. But I'd like to apologize first to say that I cannot stay on. I'm right in the middle of a session of a conference here in Istanbul. But let me just share with you for a few minutes, because there's wonderful panel of speakers here, our thoughts on the outcomes of the FFD4 and what does that mean for our feminist agenda. I'm going to take heavily from the indictment, because it is a very important indictment of the outcomes of the FFD4, from the declaration of the FFD4 Civil Society Forum, and what are the conclusions we have reached as a collective regarding the outcome document. And also a little bit of thoughts on what actually transpired in Seville. Because, one of the reprehensible things about this whole process is that the outcome document was actually finalized at least 2 weeks before Seville. So that the Seville conference, the conference in Seville, did not make any major decisions that changed anything about what was negotiated even before the governments reached Seville. So you could also then understand why that there has been, very phlegmatic or very not very enthusiastic participation of many governments in the different sessions. You would find sessions where towards the last 30 minutes, there's hardly any more government representatives in the room, because, it was a done deal, basically. So our reflection on the outcome document is something that we had already arrived at even before we arrived in Seville. And then let's also look very, very shortly on what actually transpired. So these conclusions that I draw from the declaration are the following major points or highlights or headlines. First, the member states, and I echo what Sai has already said, compromised on the ambition that should have been delivered to reflect the urgency of our times, and a lack of political will to embrace bold reforms. And this, the outcome, of course, was mainly influenced by the fact, or shaped by the fact, that there were main blockers of any real progress, and these blockers were global north countries, and this is not a surprising fact. There was very active undermining and opposition to the proposals for actionable mandates for the transformation of the international debt and aid architectures, for one, which are, of course, we see as very vital to address the colonial and patriarchal legacies enshrined in the current financial architecture. There was a lack of transparency throughout the whole negotiation process and accountability of the process, and restrictions of civil society participation, which continued up to and was even worsened during the Seville conference. The usual spaces that we had in previous FFD4 conferences were not there. And, up to the very last minute, we were left wondering about what the official responses were for the standing requests and demands for the civil society space. Of course, we had a historical action in Seville, first time that we as civil society had a big mobilization inside the negotiation venue. But this is not to the credit of the UN structures and decision-making policy, but because of the persistence of civil society to press forward with our demands for the civil society space. Now, more specifically, here is where the civil or the FFD4 outcomes failed. First, the FFD4 outcomes failed to make meaningful progress on establishing a global financing framework that we have always demanded for many years, that should be centered on human rights, that should promote the stability of the biosphere and brings all planetary boundaries back to a safe zone, and uphold the principle of CBDR, of common but differentiated responsibilities, that should address the redistribution of care work, which is predominantly done by women, as we all know, and acknowledges and addresses the racial dimension of sustainable development. The outcome document also failed to prioritize public financing for high-quality essential service and move beyond an over-reliance on private finance to fill in development financing gaps. It failed to address the equity for income distribution. It failed to strengthen and uphold democratic space and civic participation. And it failed to call for reparations for the economic and environmental harm caused by colonialism, patriarchy, slavery, and resource extraction from the global south. And just to bring me to my last few points, the outcome document should have included a clear commitment to shift away from so-called debt resolution mechanisms, which are dominated by creditors. It should have taken us steps forward for a process towards a UN Framework Convention on Sovereign Debt, one of the very strong calls by civil society. The outcome document did not take on ecological and climate breakdown as cross-cutting issues, which we had demanded for many, many months, and proposed solutions and systemic transformations. Instead, it did not even clearly acknowledge the need to phase out fossil fuels. There should have been a clear call for scaling up of delivery of public climate and environmental finance by countries of the global north, because that is an obligation they owe us, the global south, because of a climate and ecological debt. The FFD4 should also have been a rare opportunity to commit to and initiate a process towards a cohesive democratic system of global governance, away from what we already have right now, a colonial legacy where developing countries remain locked into systems that structurally exclude and marginalize us. And the outcome document, which is also an echo of what the Feminist Forum Declaration have said, should have acknowledged that no real financing justice can be reached without an urgent end to escalating wars, territorial invasions, and genocides from Gaza to Sudan and the Democratic Republic of Congo and other places. And then the FFD4 outcome document should have reflected what should be our aim, a genuine partnership between rights holders, member states, development partners, based on equity, based on transparency and accountability, based on parity, and strengthening the integrity and ambition for our shared agenda for transforming the international financial systems. The Sevilla commitment actually was an attempt to map a way out to get to somewhere. So that was already a done deal before we even reached Seville. And in Seville, there was this Sevilla platform of action, which I urge everyone to also critically assess. It's a string of more than 100 initiatives that was launched during the conference. And just looking at it very quickly, the string of these initiatives, what we can say that it has failed us, and more than that, instead, it's pushing forward many what we call false finance solutions, which reinforce the inequitable and exploitative nature and elements of the international financial system. So I join Sai in saying, no, the FFD4 did not deliver on our feminist agenda. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lidy. Thank you for sharing your time with us today. And it's unfortunate, as you mentioned about the war scene in the world, that we find that as health budgets are being compromised by governments, defense budgets are rising every year. They are on the rise. So uh, perhaps the governments, they are preferring war to peaceful solutions and the well-being of the common people. So that is a sorry state of affairs. And I hope the asks again, as I said, of the feminist forum, they are met with, and that the divide between the global north and global south is dismantled completely. We do not deserve actually what we are getting. Thank you very much. I now invite Zainab Shumail, coordinator at Asia Pacific Forum on Women, Law and Development, or APWLD as we call it, to share her perspective of the FFD4 outcomes and how they compare with our feminist vision and demands. Over to you, Zainab.
Thank you so much, Shobha, for having APWLD today in the panel with all of our colleagues and allies that I do remember seeing just now a few days ago in Sevilla. Um, I think my intervention today will be sectioned into parts where I think we can reflect on our experience as participants in that space from Asia Pacific, and also, comment up on the process itself of the negotiation, finalization of the outcome document, and then the experience of being in that space, navigating that space with different stakeholders with different, levels of privileges and accessibility, and then commenting upon, the content of the outcome document and how, to what extent it delivers on the demands that we went in with in that space, and then what are the gaps that still exist and the fights that are still open, right? So I echo almost everything that Sai and Lidy have detailed before me with regards to the process and with regards to the content of, the outcomes. I think if the question is to what extent F54 outcomes or the process itself delivered on the feminist agenda, I don't think I have a very bright picture to paint. Because, when we talk about feminist agenda, when we talk about feminist transformation, we cannot do it without an assessment of, to what extent the inherent power hierarchies in the global financial and political and governance orders have been identified, recognized, problematized, and challenged. And if we are to answer that question, it is almost negative, the answer almost zero, where we see that the whole process of, shaping up the outcome document as it looks to today, and also the process of engagement of the civil society there mirrored exactly, the power inequities and disparities in the global financial order that we are struggling with. And so, just starting from the very beginning, in terms of participation in that space, I feel like, yeah, who is present in the room, who gets to speak, and to what extent? It's all political, right? And so, for participants from Asia and the Pacific, there were challenges right from the very beginning in terms of making it to Sevilla. Just the very act of, making sure that we are present in this space, and that begins from the very beginning in terms of, everyone is aware of the strength of the passports that our countries hold. So there is a huge, exhausting bureaucratic process that we have to navigate through to be able to, acquire visas. And that requires time, that requires very efficient, timely support in terms of accreditation, in terms of, providing all documentation and giving as much of a window for visa applications to be processed. And there were several cases where, almost several participants from the region that we were facilitating the participation of, even our own team at APWLD. We did struggle with visa issues, and we weren't sure up until the last day whether we will be able to, travel to the Shenzhen area to be able to participate in that space. So that was one. And then not only leading up to Sevilla, but when we got to Sevilla, the way that the whole space was designed in terms of infrastructure, we could see that there were segregation in terms of, disengagement with the civil society, and where the heads of states and the governments were present and engaging with the space. So there were restrictions and restricted access to the spaces to make sure that we could amplify our realities and political demands while we were there. And as Lidy also mentioned, the outcome document had already been adopted before we were even in Sevilla. So the room or any prospects of influencing the conversation were out of the window. And we knew it going to Sevilla. So then our strategy redirected to making sure that we make as much noise while we are in Sevilla, while we are in that space, to amplify what our realities at the grassroots are and what the political demands that emerged from there. But even then, we could see that there were restrictions, doing that, just exercising our right to free speech. We could see elements of shrinking civic space in that formal advocacy space where, we were heavily censored in terms of, the materials that we could carry, even, as harmless objects as fans. It was 40-45 degrees in Sevilla, and people were holding handheld fans, and we weren't able to take those into the venue because, if the slogan on the fan says "debt kills development," that is unacceptable to be carried into the space, and it was so ridiculous that we had to abandon those items. We couldn't have stickers that could be perceived as political on our laptops. We couldn't carry resource publications, the reports that we have produced out of really hard labor of, collecting evidence of our lived realities at the grassroots. We couldn't carry those into the space. So just little instances like these, accumulating to communicate a sense of being, surveilled, being and curtailed and censored. So there were these issues, and then, like I said, the way that the space was designed was also very segregated. So we were restricted in terms of accessing the floor when engaging with the government states. So all of the speaking slots that the civil society FFD mechanism did manage to secure came as a result of a lot of hard labor. We were able to deliver statements at the roundtables. We were able to deliver our political declaration from the civil society forum, but it was a struggle. So all in all, we could see that, when we talk about a feminist assessment of the experience, we do see that there are power hierarchies. We do see that there is lack of transparency, accountability, and also shrinking of civic space. So none of it is feminist. And so we're unable to, evaluate it positively as much as whatever PR materials are coming out of the UN. And the global North governments that did engage at the space. So that's for the process. With regards to the outcome document itself, the content of it, I agree with Sai that the outcome document does have several things that we do support and we're happy about. And so I think I will also begin with saying, what the outcome document has, and then, following it up with what it does not have, and, what our battles still remain that are open. So the outcome document does talk about the access of women to economic markets, labor markets, and the importance of women as, the potential benefit that they can bring to the economy. The outcome document also recognizes that peace is imperative for sustainable development. And the outcome document also mentions, it recognizes the impact of debt servicing obligations on, the prospects of achieving sustainable development goals, and how it does burden the public finances and fiscal resources that are available to achieve SDGs. So all of these things are very welcome. But what I will also echo with regards to what Sai and Lidy both said, that overall, we do see that the outcome document lacks genuine ambition, because while we do support and we are happy about all of these things being recognized, the push for systemic transformation, what we call feminist restructuring of the financial architecture, I think there is a long way to go before that is actualized. Because, for instance, if the outcome document talks about women and girls as economic potentials, they that does not amount to much as long as the systemic discrimination and disadvantages that women and girls feel when trying to access the labor markets, economic markets, that is not realized, right? Or if the principles of decent work and safeguards for their fundamental human rights at their workplaces are not ensured. When you talk about the importance of peace for sustainable development and the fulfillment of human rights, but at the same time, even in that physical space, there is no mention at all of the genocide that is going on. And the impact of increasing militarization that is having, I'm speaking from the perspective of Asia and the Pacific, and a prime example of how these are not just abstract conversations that happen in high spaces. These instances have real consequences and repercussions for us who are in the region. I think a prime example was just days before F-54 itself, where most of us from the region, from Asia and the Pacific, who were to travel westward to Spain, we were going to stop over at Doha. And just a day before we were all supposed to fly out, we got that directive that Qatar has closed its airspaces. And why was that? It was because Iran had attacked U.S. military bases in Qatar. So we then had to make a decision of whether even to proceed with our plans to travel in that situation where once we are airborne, anything could happen. And so it was a matter of life and death, even when planning a simple decision of whether to participate at a conference or at an advocacy space like this. So I think, yeah, there are numerous examples of how these are our lived realities, these are our everyday realities, and these are the decisions that we have to tend with, um, resulting from the conversations and the decisions that are taken in the spaces like these, and which makes it all the more important why we, the rights holders, are given as much visibility, as much space to put forward our lived realities and our political demands, to make sure that our fundamental human rights, the fundamental human rights of the people in the global south are fulfilled and not violated on a daily basis. Moving on to other things in the outcome document, we also talk about, Lidy mentioned the reformation or the transformation of the international financial architecture. And honestly, that whole process was a joke when it comes to the transformation of the debt architecture, where we see that throughout the various stages of working on the debt section in the outcome document, what it came down to, what it looks like in the outcome document right now, the document, that version that was adopted, is that while yes, the outcome document does recognize the impact of um, uh, obligatory debt servicing on fiscal resources, the process itself eventually is limiting. The civil society was pushing for an intergovernmental process governed by and within the UN, and moving the mandate and the power away from the international financial institutions. But unfortunately, what was deeply disappointing to witness, very gradually throughout the negotiation process, is that the mandate of the intergovernmental process that we were trying to push throughout, it was reduced to merely producing recommendations, and that also for guiding principles that are voluntary, that are not mandatory. There is no accountability on whether those principles are abided by. Um, And so there's no liability for anyone who violates those principles. So you reduce the mandate of the intergovernmental process that we are pushing for a more just and equitable debt financial architecture. And you are instead, even worse, adding insult to injury, is that you are giving primacy. You are centralizing even further the international financial institutions that are perpetuating the grave human rights violations from instances of servicing debts that are illegitimate, that are odious, that are a burden on the lives of the most marginalized in the global south. So yeah, I think overall the assessment of whether F54 met our demands in terms of a feminist envisioning of the financial architecture, I think that is unfortunately the answer is a resounding no. And what I think has been made clear to us is that a lot of fights that we are fighting at the moment, they still remain open. And we know that we will continue to engage in these spaces, of course, because we will not concede any of the spaces that civil society has secured for itself so far, but that a lot of mobilizing power, a lot of our solidarity, a lot of our movements will be continuing to go on outside these formal spaces. And for that, there is a lot of need for political consolidation within regional allies across regions, and so yeah, so I think that is one lesson that we've learned from our experience as participants from the global south in this space. And so yeah, I think I'll stop here, and please excuse me if my frustration and anger has come through in my inputs, because honestly, yeah, patience is running thin, because we it's lives of millions of people who are being impacted, and not only their lives in the present time and moment, but also their generations to come, right? So please forgive me if I'm not being polite, as but I'll be happy to hear what everyone else thinks, and yeah, happy to take any further questions also on my comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Zainab. Thank you very much. And we share your frustration, all of us. And I do hope the rightful noises made by civil society do result in some tangible actions by our governments, first of all, and where accountability is lacking. And as you said, that nothing is mandatory, it is left to the governments and it depends upon them. So without accountability, how much can be achieved and what can be achieved? I do hope that the world does not remain a place of a few people, by a few people, and for a few people. That narrative has to change. Thank you for being with us here today. Our next speaker is Shereen Talaat, founder and director of Middle East and North Africa Feminist Movement for Economic Development and Ecological Justice, MENA FEM Movement. Welcome, Shereen. We are keen to listen to FFT4 outcomes in the context of gender equality in the MENA region. Over to you.
Thanks a lot, Shobha, and thanks a lot for everybody who's attending today, and my colleagues and sisters who already shared different insights. I don't want to repeat. I agree on all what they mentioned. I don't want to repeat, but there is something very important that we need to put our hand on, and to be clear with ourselves. This finance in development conference wasn't about finance and development. It was about the dead horse that they want to bring back to life, which is the multilateral system. After what is happening in the States and the rising of the right wings everywhere, and the United States decided to pull out of the negotiations and the finance and development. So Europeans wanted to be the champions of the multilateral system. And given the fact that, as my colleagues mentioned, that the final statements was out 2 weeks before the the conference itself, it tells us a lot. Coming out with initiatives for us that is false solutions, that is telling a lot. And as you all saw the outcomes that on at least gender equality, gender equality financing dropped to 42% of ODA in 2022. Only 4% of ODA had gender as a primary objective. Less than 1% reach feminist and women rights organizations. Humanitarian aid and gender objectives fell from 19% to 17%. We have numbers that is talking here. Even the UN Women estimated like 420 billion annual gap to meet gender target in developing countries. That isn't a progress. This is a backsliding. And the feminist movements around the globe came to the FFD with clear demands. The binding commitment to finance care, health, social protection, debt cancellation linked to gender and climate justice, redistribution of power and resources, end austerity and end extractive tax system, direct and unrestricted funding for feminist organizing. And that didn't happen. We got soft language and voluntary principles, no timelines, no enforcement. Meanwhile, the 25% of countries are reiterating on gender rights. Conflict-related sexual violence is up to 50%. Gaza, Sudan, Congo, and beyond, women face war and displacements. The IMF backed austerity and eroding basic services. Rights are being rolled back while financing disappears. Even UN agencies are slashing gender programs under budget pressure. The problem is that what FFD delivered, the civil platform for action, or I don't know why they are super happy with the debt for natural swap that World Bank and Spain initiate as well. For us, those all false solutions. And the problem is that the system is repeating itself, but changing, using some soft language and some polite promises that is not going to be fulfilled. And from others till now, and the world is burning. I'm coming from Southeast Asia and North Africa, and my colleague here was speaking about how they needed to decide because of the war between the occupation entity that they call Israel and Iran. They didn't know either to go to CV or to go back to their countries because what happened in Qatar. I'm Egyptian. I live in Morocco. Imagine my families and my colleagues that it was holding up everywhere in this region, and I didn't know if I was only thinking about if I'm going to be able to see my family because of the restrictions or not. It is crazy, and it's still crazy, and that is our reality. That the FFD and all the other discussions around the global financial architecture is missing. In the time of the FFD and during the meetings in CV, 19 young girls lost their lives in Egypt because of austerity measures. But that didn't move anything or change anything on the negotiations that happened in Sevilla. And this didn't matter for anyone. What was really matter is to save the multilateral system. and to come out with, for us, a progress that doesn't matter. It doesn't matter for us, for people, especially people from the global south. It only matters for the existing global economical system, the capitalistic system that it is still trying to push same old methodologies, but with new terms and new faces and new shapes. That's why we, at the end of May 2025, this year, we gathered together on the Global Feminist Gathering in Rabat. We tried to find a slightly safe country in the North Africa and Southeast Asia. We only found Rabat. So we gathered together and tried to, more than 60 feminists from around the globe, majority from the global south and the MENA region, and the colleagues from the north, from the global movement, also to think together what we are going to do. We have to stop to be reactions of the global, the existing global economical architecture calls, but we need to be the actions, and we need to strategize ourselves from with our feminist principles, and and the world need to act in solidarity with our demands. And we came out with the Rabat roadmap that calls for and demands as specific demands that will be our strategies for the upcoming years. The first of them is breaking the shackles of debt and financial colonialization, and hold this international financial system accountable, but also think about how we put our southern sovereignty and alternative economics ahead, forward, coming out with and reject the paradigm of the economic growth that further destroys the planet and exploit people. We also propose our own alternative, because we have our own alternative and our own narrative, an anti-colonial, anti-imperial narrative that we need to work and we need to enforce from the heart of the MENA region to the whole global south and the global movement. And we also demanded a just financial system that ends with disparity, and a climate justice and climate finance, not a green colonialization, like all the outcomes, unfortunately, from the APWLD. Also, Palestine, Sudan, Congo, and Yemen at the heart of the fight against colonialization and militarization. I will share the roadmap when it is finalized, but I also share the frustration, and I say and join the voice of already my sisters who spoke, that the APWLD failed women rights, and the APWLD failed the feminist agenda, and failed the people and planet. Thank you.
Thank you, Shereen. Thank you for being so outspoken in what you have said. We are all with you. And although it has been, the outcome has been anti-women, anti-us, but we have to remain united as what we say, sisters, persisters, and resistors, and carry on the fight. Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Swetha Sridhar, Senior Global Policy Research Officer at FOSS Feminista, which is an intersectional feminist organization centered around sexual and reproductive rights and needs of women, girls, and gender diverse people. Swetha, can you please share your insights on how FFD4 outcomes would impact sexual and reproductive health, rights, and justice in the global south?
First off, thank you so much, Shobha, for having me here today to join this incredible panel. I think one of the challenges of speaking after my incredible colleagues, Sai, Lidy, Zainab, and Shereen, there's really not much more that I can say that they haven't already said in terms of the anger that we're feeling as feminists. But I think to kind of underline some of the points that they were making and to reiterate it, I'd really like to focus a little bit on the process of negotiation and the document to kind of highlight how the Global South has really been let down by the financing for development conversation. So as everyone mentioned, the political declaration known as the Compromiso de Sevilla or the Sevilla Commitment was adopted by consensus on the first day of the conference, and the text represented the outcome of months of tense negotiations between member states beginning in early 2025, and some of the most debated issues predictably along the minority world, majority world lines were the questions of what debt relief would look like, what tax restructure would look like, what trade reform would look like, how much we were willing to commit to climate change, and who would commit to climate change, and of course, references to gender equality. From the first point of view, these issues of debt, tax, trade, justice are all deeply intertwined with a feminist SRHR agenda. For example, we know that financial autonomy translates to greater bodily autonomy, and the gendered impacts of poverty leave marginalized communities unable to access SRHR services. And this is really the perspective that we brought leading up to the advocacy that was happening in the months before the FFD, right? Prioritizing intersectionality and highlighting really the connection between finance, development, human rights, and gender equality. And we were strongly hoping that the process of negotiation would reflect this. But in practice, we saw that there was a separation of gender equality and human rights from conversations on climate, debt, and tax justice. And this is a practice that we saw not just at FFT, but we're also seeing in how negotiations are happening across the board, where issues like gender or equality or human rights get slotted into particular negotiating spaces like CSW or 3C, rather than seeing them as cross-cutting issues that should inform all conversations and development commitments. That said, from a feminist point of view, the political declaration is a bit of a mixed bag in terms of its commitments. First, on the issue of gender inclusion in public financing, we did see that political declaration reaffirms member state commitments to gender equality, specifically in paragraph 11 of the text. And it additionally commits to mainstreaming a gender perspective and promoting gender-responsive solutions in the existing financing agenda. The question is the existing financing agenda what we want, or do we want a larger reform? Similarly, in paragraph 27G, we see further commitments to promoting gender-responsive budgeting and gender-responsive taxation by enhancing monitoring and evaluation of budgets with a gender perspective. Second, the text does commit to increasing investment in the care economy and to recognize value and equitably redistribute the disproportionate share of unpaid care and domestic work done by women. However, while this mention does indicate a positive step in addressing gendered care burdens, the reference itself does not meet the most progressive existing standards in terms of language on care, which the ILO has set out. Specifically, paragraph 11 again calls on member states to, quote, recognize, value, and equitably redistribute, whereas the ILO calls, quote, recognize, redistribute, reduce, reward, and represent unpaid care and domestic work, which really shows a missed opportunity for member states to advance normative frameworks and commitments to care economy within the text. Third, on issues related to health, in paragraph 19, member states reaffirm their commitments to increasing investment in universal health coverage and inclusive, equitable, affordable, quality, and resilient health systems. While we recognize that this is an improvement from, the previous political language that was in the Addis Ababa Action Agenda, which does not have any paragraph on universal health coverage, this is not really a positive step because there's absolutely no mention of sexual and reproductive health and rights, or how this idea of universal health coverage will be rolled out in the context of increased spending on militarization, on the commitments, the lack of commitments to ending austerity, and the pressures of debt refinancing. So this is a giant gap in the political declaration, especially considering the strong interlinkages between SRHR and economic justice that Sai also alluded to earlier. Obviously, these are really minor wins in a text that's over 40 pages long. I've given you 3 examples, and I'd be hard-pressed to find maybe another 3 examples in such a long text. And we significantly lack any language or any ambition on economic justice, gender justice, and reproductive justice in the document. It's painfully clear that a gender and human rights approach to financing was not mainstreamed throughout the text, and the idea of feminist values are completely missing. This linkage between gender equality, human rights, and sustainable development is especially critical in the context of the conversation around the Sustainable Development Goals, or the SDGs, in the next 5 years. In multilateral spaces, as most of you may already know, we're witnessing incredible pushback against the implementation and language on SDGs. For example, during negotiations for the 69th session of the Commission on Status of Women earlier this year, the US repeatedly rejected language related to the advancement or recognition of the 2030 Agenda. During the 58th session of the Commission of Population and Development, or CPD, the US indicated their desire to call the outcome document to a vote over the inclusion of long-standing consensual language regarding the SDGs, despite overwhelming support for it from member states cross-regionally on its importance and value in multilateralism. In fact, at the initial presentation of the Compromiso de Sevilla in New York as well, the US withdrew their participation from the process over language included in the text, including specific references to the SDGs. And as we go into the renewal of the SDGs over the next 5 years, this growing resistance and general opposition to achieving sustainable development will remain a major barrier in achieving justice and equity for people around the world. Against this background, we also know that the advancement of gender equality and human rights, specifically SRHR, has publicly been deprioritized, often on the justification that there is scarce resources and funding. We strongly call attention to the fact that this is not the case. The problem isn't having resources to address these rights, but having the political will to do so. Concurrent to the FFD4 conference, NATO allies met and pledged to increase defense spending to 5% of GDP, 3.5% on military expenditure, and 1.5% on loosely defined defense. Yet these same countries, the same NATO countries, during negotiations for the FFD, refused to include a reference to debt cancellation for the Global South. This increased commitment to militarization without relieving the persistent debt crisis remains a major gap in the FFD process. Similarly, we saw that during the negotiations, gender equality was often used as a bargaining chip to sidestep debate on issues such as climate change or global taxation, with countries often conceding to inclusion of gender over substantive discussions on any of these issues. For all these reasons, from a political point of view, it's difficult to say that the FFD delivered on gender equality and a feminist agenda. It's truly impossible to advance feminist priorities without addressing these issues and without, any substantive conversation on like a significant restructure of financial architecture globally, and a restructuring that prioritizes justice, equity, and human rights. Yes, the adoption of the declaration was important at a time when multilateralism itself is a threat. But if multilateralism isn't serving the purpose of women, girls, and gender diverse people across the world, then is there a point to it, and how much do we protect it? So from the perspective of the conference, it's also difficult to say that gender equality was centered and was protected. I know my colleagues have talked about how civil society were consistently sidelined through the conference, so I'm not going to go into that in much detail, but just to say that it was a meaningful space to listen, learn, and bring our feminist agenda to the table, even if we often felt like we were speaking in the same 4 rooms to the same people, and the impact of our message was considered a challenge and a disruption. We are incredibly grateful for the work of the Feminist Workstream, who hosted 2 feminist actions in Sevilla, bringing a global spotlight to our feminist demands. And I can see Mabel here, who will probably speak a little bit more about those actions. I think I'd just like to close by saying that it goes without saying that we need gender equality, sexual and reproductive health and rights, and bodily autonomy to be reflected in conversations on development and development financing urgently. We need large-scale reforms to international financial architecture and debt regimes that break colonial patterns of financial extraction and neo-imperial capitalist modes of global resource allocation and use. Without major reforms and restructuring of the international financial architecture, the implementation of the FFD4 will continue to advance the current financial norms, and economic, gender, and reproductive justice will remain unattainable for women, girls, and gender diverse individuals around the world. Unfortunately, that's not a very optimistic note to end on, but that is the state that the FFD has left us all in. Back to you, Shobha.
Thank you very much, Swetha. And I firmly believe that after so much of darkness, there will be light, which happens. And what the feminist movement and feminist forum did in Seville, that will be carried forward, and the messages will be carried forward through this session and through numerous other such meetings. Thank you very much. And last but not the least in any way, I invite Mabel Bianco to share her thoughts. Mabel is a physician activist from Latin America and founding president of FEIM, FEIM, which translates into Foundation for Studies and Research on Women. Mabel has been a leading activist in Latin America and globally, introducing policies addressing breast cancer, HIV/AIDS, reproductive rights, and gender reform in the UN. Welcome, Mabel. We are indeed honored to have you with us today and listen to you.
Hello, thank you so much. Are you, you
Yes,
can listen to me?
Yes, we can
Yes?
hear you very clearly. Yes, yes.
Okay, thank you so much. Well, first of all, I want to thank to be invited to be with you today, because I think it's so important that we can share from the different regions and perspectives what we feel, our frustration, but also our support to continue fighting. Because as you know, we continue fighting, and this is the reality we are facing. First of all, I want to say that I'm not going to repeat what was said, but this is the Sevilla. It was not, the declaration is mentioned compromiso de Sevilla. In Spanish, when we translate compromiso, is commitment. And this is not the truth, because as you see, no commitment at all in the declaration, in this compromiso de Sevilla. So what do we have? We have now a good paper with many mentions, but words, but nothing else. It's empty of commitment. This is the problem. This is why we have been fighting so much, but finally the governments, and some of them, as it was said, because it's very interesting to know that some countries, that they are not the majority, but they, as we have the consensus, they could change. And this is the US with the Trump government, and many others, as my own country, Argentina, that they are following Trump, saying no discrimination against women. They are not believed, and they retired from the UN for the SDGs and the Agenda 2030 because they say no discrimination. My God, where they are living, they are not living and seeing what happened everywhere. And also in the US, because the discrimination of women and girls worldwide is a reality. It's not nothing they could say this is not, but they deny, and they deny, and what they did, they negotiate without us, giving us a very few possibility before Sevilla. So when we reach there, they have this compromiso de Sevilla that is completely weak, and saying they promote, they want to push, but also they put the words, but nothing else. This is the problem. And in the case of sexual and reproductive rights, they didn't say, as it was said before, it's a good advance that they mention the access of health coverage. but not about sexual and reproductive health. And this is what we need, because it's not possible to reach development if we are not having these rights recognized, including access to safe abortion. So I think we need to continue saying, because Sevilla, it was only a point. We need to recognize it's a very important one. But as it is so weak now, what is finished, we need to consider that this is not the end. This is the beginning of our fight. We are going to put on those words and push along all the other moments that we are fighting in the UN. We are going to put what we need. We are not resigning of our principles, of our ideas, of our proposals. And if you look at our paper about the Feminist Forum and our proposal, this is what we need to put it there. We need to continue. And next week is the first moment in which we are going to the high-level political forum and we are going to discuss 3 objectives: 5, empowerment of women; 3, health; 8, labor. In these 3, we need to come back again to say what we say in Sevilla and fight that they recognize, because this is something in which the governments need to recognize that the UN is not only governments. They are not realizing that is the people, we the people. This is the UN. So we need to be also fighting about how is going to be the change of the new UN that they want to have. Are they going to give us outside again? Are they going to give us not able to speak, to participate, to listen? Because we recognize UN is an intergovernmental, but we have the right to attend the meetings and listen what the governments of the states are saying and be able to fight for them nationally, regionally, and worldwide. So this is something that we need to push and to be able to come. And I think as feminists, we have to be very careful about the revitalization of our CSW, because this is something in which they are trying to make this, that they are putting us aside. Why? Because they suppose the states need to be recognizing and accepting who of us will be accepted to attend those meetings. This is not what we can accept. And I make this telling you because these are processes that are together. And while we are fighting in Sevilla, they are fighting there about revitalization of the CSW. And we need to look at that, not allowing them to put in this revitalization the same ideas that they practice in Sevilla, because we were not allowed to participate in an equal terms. This is very, very important. We need to recover our right to participate. Of course, we are not going to vote because we are not government, but our voice needs to be there. And really, for Sevilla, it wasn't in the process and also in the conference, and as was said. And it's so funny because in Sevilla, we went there for the side events where we can discuss with the government, we can discuss with the UN agencies, and not to the official meetings. And also the governments are so bored, they don't go there. Why? Everything was decided. This is not the way to do the things. These meetings are the way where we need to continue pushing. And as you know, in all those UN meetings now or conference, they want to discuss the declaration or the agreed conclusion or whatever they call, before without our participation not so full. So we couldn't allow that. We need to be fighting in both sides, in the process and in the contents. This is what is our challenge now. And our challenge is to make the frustration our really energy to go and continue fighting. And I request you, please, don't be frustrated and thinking we lose. We didn't lose. They want we lose. We lose when we finish fighting, and they are not going to obtain that because feminists, we know how difficult all the rights we obtain everywhere at national, at regional, and global level is due to our fight. And we couldn't stop and say everything was reached. No. And for the young people, I think for the young girls, for the young women, we need to bring these ideas. They need to recognize that what we reached before is not forever. We need to maintain fighting to be sure they are going to be done. And the most important issue now is that we need to duplicate or triplicate in order to fight at national level, because this is something that with these words, because they say elimination of gender-based violence, but they didn't commit to nothing for that. So we need to do. They didn't do nothing about change the militarization expenditures they are doing, in which they are leaving us without money to do our things. So recently they approved this in Europe or the OTAN to have this 5% of increase in militaries. They didn't say nothing about that. They are so comfortable on that. And so this is the money they are taking off for our programs, for the benefit of all the people, not only the women and girls, but especially women and girls, but not only. So this is the issues we need to continue fighting at national level. Also the issue of redistribution, taxation. Tax needs to be reformed. We are fighting so much. They are not equally distributed. This is the big gaps we have in the distribution. We need to eliminate that. And SDG 1, that is about to eliminate poverty, is not true now if we are not changing the redistribution, and the redistribution is the policies on taxation. And so we need to continue fighting on that. And of course, the UN must be. And the death, what about? Most of our countries in the north and in the south, but especially in the south, we are suffering from the death. And what it is, they don't say anything about the issue of not continue privatization and this model for health, for education, for social benefits. What is this? This is the terrible issue in which we are involved there. So we need to break this, opposite this. Of course, they didn't say nothing about extractivism and how is the policy. So I think we need to have and use our feminist forum conclusion and declaration, where is the root, what we need to do, how we need to do, and we need to be together, because what they want is to separate us, to put us in different places. So I think we need to separate and we need to be united more as always. So sorry, I didn't say more about the contents, but it will say everything. My previous did everything. So I think we need to go to look at the process, how we move and how we take care not to allow them to continue. And we need to be sure who are those governments that are really interested and work with them against those others that are against. And the human rights needs to be come back, because women's rights are human rights and they are not respected human rights. They are not respecting our rights. So, my dears, the fight still starts. Sorry to say. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Mabel. Thank you for filling it with so much of energy and inspiration. And the fight will continue. It must continue, and it will. And with people like you guiding us, we will see the light of the day. This is what I hope for. Thank you so much for being with us today here. And rightly mentioning that UN is just not for the governments or by the governments. It's basically of the people. And we have to reclaim that place. Yes. Very true. We now open for questions, comments, and reflections from our participants. There was a question by Varuni Nong that there is growing realization of debt and global north has been plundering global south for centuries. Should we use this more to demand changing or rebuilding financial architecture? Zainab had already replied to this question in the chat box. And Zainab says, I'm just reading it out for the benefit of people who would be watching this, maybe not present here, but watching the recording, so they would have everything which they can listen to. Zainab has said that systematic accountability for the historical role of the global north is causing and perpetuating the debt crisis in the global south, along with reparations and non-debt creating finances are central demands for a feminist transformation of the existing international financial architecture. Would any of the other speakers also respond to this question? Any of the speakers? The question is, should we use this more to demand changing or rebuilding financial architecture? The plundering of global south by the global north. Mabel, would you like to add something to it?
Yes, may I? I
Yes.
think this is something that we need to recognize, that this needs to continue be fighting. How? This is the issue. We need to be sure that there are some governments, because we need to find our allies among the governments. This is something that we need to recognize. They are not, the most of them, with the US and all these people that deny and doesn't want to meet anything. So we need to find that. For example, we find that Spain is a friendly government, but they couldn't do more. Mexico also is a positive. And I think there are many in the Asia Pacific. And I don't know, but I think Nepal is one of those. And Nepal is going to be the next president for the ECOSOC. So we need to find these governments and continue working with them at national, regional, and global level. And I know this is going to be very difficult, but we also need to find those economists well known in UN, as Jeffrey Sachs, Stiglitz, and others, that they are also thinking that this is necessary. So I think we need to find and do these alliances and continue fighting. But we need to have strong alliances. This is something I think we need to develop more and be sure that they are in the different regions, that we could not only work regionally, but also worldwide. And we need to bring the voices. And this is the most important. That's why I'm saying we need to go and have people coming from our feminist group to all UN conference and places. Now, the high-level political forum next week is something where we need to have the voice there, you know? So I think this is the way. Of course, we are not able to do it alone, but we have many, many people, governments, and also other agencies that we can work together. We need to be organized this and doing this.
Thank you. Thank you, Mabel. There is a question by Bianco Nyanida. Is there transparency and accountability in the utilization of funds dedicated for SRHR advocacy? I must admit that corruption continues to hinder our progress. I'm speaking for Kenya. And how can we effectively address and mitigate this challenge? And there is another question by Miko Zulu, that there are many barriers to feminism, especially in Africa, which include cultural barriers, religious and political ones. Is there any agenda to address these issues in sustainability? Any of the speakers, would you please like to respond? Means all of you can respond if you wish to, please, because it is not directed towards a particular speaker. Swetha or Shereen, please do respond.
I think specifically on the question around corruption, it is definitely a problem that is being addressed by a number of people working on this issue of governance reform, specifically around sustainability, especially in the context of the conversation around shrinking national budgets and financing availability for the SDGs and for human rights and gender equality at the national level. Conversations around corruption are increasingly making their way into these rooms because we recognize that a large portion of those budgets are actually being eaten away and diverted from what they're meant to do. So I guess the short answer is yes, we must have a conversation around corruption. And it remains, and unfortunately, I guess this is the onus of, this is the burden of also being a part of this movement, is that we take on a lot of this labor that we do, not just in terms of advocating for the issues that are core to us, but in terms of larger systemic reform to ensure that the issues that we care about are centered and highlighted. To the question about the barriers to feminism around because of culture, religion, and political agendas, my limited point would be to say that we don't always have to frame the conversation in the language of feminism. We can arrive at the same outcomes in multiple ways using language that accommodates all of us. We do know that there are people who are using religious language to arrive at the same SRHR outcomes and to guarantee access to the same services and to the same rights for women, girls, and gender diverse people. We do know that there are people on both sides of the political spectrum fighting for these same issues. And so we shouldn't let one word stop us. We realize that the word is debated often, but ultimately the question is also what are the outcomes that we are working towards and how can we get to those while working hand in hand. I want to reiterate that this is not in any way to diminish the importance of feminism or the movement that we are working towards, but to recognize that people come to the same outcome in different ways and we must hold space for all of those approaches. That's my limited point. Maybe Shobha, back to you or one of the other speakers.
Thank you. Yes, maybe Shereen would like to add something. Shereen?
Yes, I mean, in covering the all of the questions that was asked in terms of the emerging of the debt situation, etc. Actually it's this global economical system already admit that we are in a huge debt disaster. I mean, if you listen to Christina Gorgieva at the beginning of the spring meetings this year, and also Ajay Banga of the World Bank in the spring meeting and during the FFD, they used the same terms and things about how debt is becoming a huge disaster, but again they are softening their words and saying, that is not a bad thing. Yeah, that can be not a bad thing if there were justice in wealth distribution, if there were a fair and just global system that is governance debt which the civil society and the feminist movement were calling for a debt architecture reform, a UN debt mechanism, etc., but that didn't happen. But I believe in people, and I believe in our unity, as my colleagues mentioned, and our solidarity. The debt that most of the global South countries own to this global architecture is colonial debt. It's our wealth and years of extractivism, of extracting our resources, that created their wealth and leave us in this situation. So it is a time to again decolonial our narrative and speak about history and reparation for colonial debt. Besides reparation for climate, reparation for colonial debt is a very important point that we collectively we have to strongly push forward, and a south collaboration is needed in to enforce this goal. Thank you.
Thank you. Salma has asked a question. If the impact of anti-rights push, like my country is a part of Geneva Consensus Declaration, that now governments are not committing on financing SRHR and gender equality and human rights. I think this is a very pertinent question she has raised about the Geneva Consensus Declaration, which many countries have signed. It's not a declaration as such, but would the panelists like to address this? That is it having, this is a part of the anti-rights push, and is it having an effect on governments not committing on financing SRHR?
I could take this if this is
Yes,
okay.
please.
I think first, and this would be the most, in this moment, there's an incredible need for national level advocacy to work with governments that are in conversation with the proponents of the Geneva Consensus and its implementation framework, the Protego, to ensure that national governments do not sign up to these consensus documents. And I use the word consensus in quotes because this is not an international treaty of any format that is enforceable, accountable in the way that the consensus documents that emerge from within the United Nations are. They should not be treated with the same degree of formality. Countries should not be encouraged to hold commitments under these documents. And I think first and foremost, it is incredibly important that there is strong national level advocacy to educate decision makers, policy makers to hold fast against these documents. Second, we do know that there is a certain degree of instrumentalization of policies such as the Protego and the Geneva Consensus, with a certain amount of ODA and aid being tied to the willingness to sign on to these documents. So it becomes increasingly imperative for us to address this question of financing, to ask if aid is now increasingly going to be tied to anti-rights positions. What are some sustainable ways for feminists, for governments, for progressive governments to be able to finance the outcomes that they want to commit to and they want to see progress? Third, we also see that there are governments that are honestly internally not talking to each other. As an example, I do want to say that there are governments that have signed up to the Geneva Consensus, but are also members of, for example, active commitment makers under platforms like FP 2030 and are working to advance SDG goals on the other hand, right? So I think it might often also be a case of one hand of the government not doing what the other hand of government may be doing at the national level, which makes it really imperative for us to also be present, be loud as feminists in spaces where these decisions are being made at the national, regional, and at the global level. And finally, not to cede any of that space, as civil society, it's often held upon us to follow protocol and to be polite and to put up, propositions forth in a way that is acceptable. I think on the question of anti-rights and anti-gender advocacy, now is not the time to be polite, and to really take up space and advocate loudly. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Zainab, would you like to add something to it?
I think I completely agree with what Swetha just detailed as the next, action points with regards to this issue. I was also actually just reading the question on, the way forward and what are our learnings from this experience. And adding on to what Swetha said about national level advocacy, I think that would be my response to this question as well, where, the path forward for us as members of civil society, as members of feminist civil society, is to go back to our respective contexts, at the national level, at the regional level, and then make sure, that the implementation of whatever we have managed to achieve as part of this experience at F54 really closely monitor the implementation, the execution of the provisions, and then also monitor any adverse repercussions that are resulting from, things that we are flagging as, harmful or adverse for prospects of fulfillment of human rights. And then, engaging with decision makers, with policymakers, holding them accountable for in the global south for taking or not taking space in a formal advocacy space like this, and also for colleagues in the global north to hold their decision makers, their policy makers also accountable and give as much visibility to the lived realities of people in the global south. Another action point, I think, which is very important, well, two action points, is, closing the gap between conversations that are considered really abstract and disengaged from the lived realities of an everyday person. We think of these macroeconomic issues as being very technical and, as conversations that are to be approached like in a very technocratic manner, whereas it is our daily lives that are being governed and that are being impacted by the repercussions of these policies and decisions. So closing that gap in political education and awareness is really important. So that community work, I think, is also something that we need to focus. And following from there, building from the bottom up, I think consolidation, as I also mentioned in my remarks earlier, consolidation amongst actors at a national level, but then also allies at a sub-regional level, regional level, and then moving on to the global level, that is really important. So when we engage in a space like this, in a global international space like this, we are, as a civil society, we are as much on the same page, as much politically consolidated as possible. And then there was a question on, how to engage in the process before such a space is convened. I think if you're not already a member of the civil society FFT mechanism, there is a whole group, the way that it is structured and governed. There are various thematic groups that you can join and share your expertise and insights on. And I think that is how one can fruitfully and meaningfully get involved in the process and contribute to the work of the civil society and its engagement at FFT, this space. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. Sai had also responded to that question on anti-rights movement, but I will read it out for the benefit of others. And she says that the whole anti-rights and anti-gender agenda is full on in the global north longer than we all thought, and now showing the negative results. Anti-gender political strategies are widespread and have diffused into political realms and influencing governments. The anti-rights CSO lobby is quite strong, well-resourced, and has influence on governments. There is a question for Mabel that the age of access versus the age of consent in accessing health services has disadvantaged a lot of women in many areas. I wish the feminism cohort can take interest in this issue. And
Yes,
yes, please, Mabel, yes.
I can answer or try
Yes.
to answer.
Yes,
I
please.
think.
Yes.
I think you are talking about the issue of early marriage or unions for girls also, and also for some women, but specifically I think girls or adolescents. I think this is a problem that we need to be carefully approaching, because it's not only a health problem, it's a development problem. As you know, we need to ensure in Beijing, we have the girls, and we knew that early marriage is a very bad issue for girls. But it's not only for the girls itself, it's for the country. Because when they marry and early have pregnancies, they abandon schools, they became more poor than when they leave out. So we need to encourage in a more broad issue in which we are talking about the needs to have girls remaining in a school, being more able to participate, and it's not, so we need to move from the health to the more broad issues in which we say, well, for the governments and for the development, we need better people, because those girls, early marriage, early pregnancy, and also sometimes the families and also the men that they are with them all became more poor. When this is coming, the country is becoming poor. So we need to understand and present this as a problem for development. It's not a problem for health only. Health is a part, but we have education, we have social protection, and we have the interest of these economic people looking at macroeconomics, as we were telling, that they need to have better population to develop the real development and increase in the power of economical power of the government and the country. So we need to approach in this way. So when we are saying that we need to change the words, we are not forgetting the principles, but we are telling them things in a more broad, in order to move away from what they are putting us, that is in the health, moving to the broader issue. And I think in Sevilla, it was a very good session, more related to HIV, but it's also related to sexual and reproductive, that this is an agreement mobilized by the Spain government with the WHO, in which they promote and they are bringing the support to this, to the WHO, to be part of this, defending and accepting and promoting and ensuring the access to these issues, especially HIV, but not only sexual and reproductive health, in a way to promote development. So this is the way I think in which we need to say, and we need not to eliminate. And we are not, because sometimes, for example, in many Latin American countries, the health personnel are looking, and we are having the problem of early pregnancies, but they are not taking in care what happened with this girl. Is this in a marriage, in a union? How is she able to decide, to choose? And so we need to make them open that this is not a health problem. This is a bigger. So the health has to be promoting the access to information, to services. But more, we need to have a strong school policy, education policy, and also economical policy, that these girls and boys also, when they reach the end of the schools, they are going to be able to participate in the economical. They are going to have jobs. They are going to be able to be doing things in a more productive. So this is what we need. And about these macroeconomics, those economics are always, the economists are always, in my country now, the president is an economist, and we are fighting because he's against everything, only looking at the macroeconomic. But the microeconomic, 70% of the people has no money to eat the 30 days of a month. You can imagine? This is what we need to present. This is what in microeconomic, how the people, how we are suffering, and more, and specifically the women and girls, we are most in the poverty. So we need to move this, to present this, and have this, and not be put in the theoretical issue in which they say, no money, we need to spend less, and no services. No, no, no. We need to consider the life of the people. So I don't know if I answered, but we are fighting to eliminate early marriage or early unions and early pregnancies, because girls and the school is the better prevention method for that.
Right, very rightly said. Marta has raised the hand. I saw Marta's hand raised. Would Marta wants to say something? Her hand was raised just now. Is Marta's hand raised still? Okay. Marta from El Salvador says that there is an optimist way to finish. The people movements are all active, transformative. We are all part of it. This is very important time. This is a very important, timely effort. Great on all possible ways on the purpose. Since all my life I have worked for social movements, I would like to know what we are committed to carry out on the issue at hand. We each belong to social movements at national and regional levels. What is our plan in follow-up, not only on official, but civil society levels? I would really like an answer, please, because the real answer and transformation will not be televised and will not come from staff or officials or NGO entities. Hope to hear from someone from the panel. So we want the speakers to please reply to Marta. Yes, Mabel, and maybe the others also later if you would like to respond to her.
Well, I think I say most of that. I don't know what else can I say.
Yes.
Sorry,
You're
but
right.
I know Martha leaves because has another meeting. She writes it that
Yes.
she needs to leave.
Okay.
But I think I say we need to be as a social movement, and we are not only related to the feminists, we are also part of the big social movement. This is a very important point. We need to make it. We are not separate, and that's why in Sevilla for the preparation, we have our feminist forum, but later we go to the civil society forum, and at the end, in the last, in the only moment they allowed to speak, it was a presentation at the end in the closure of the session, bringing the voice of the two only by one person, but we are together. And this is how we are strong. Of course, we couldn't be isolated. If we are isolated, we are going to lose. So, and the big and important issue we need to be more active is on the human rights, I think. And also I recommend that we are more interested to participate in the following of the Human Rights Council in order to bring all those issues that we are suffering about discrimination and also about corruption. I think we need to denounce them, not only at national level, but at regional and at global level in the rights there, because this needs to be no, it couldn't be. Now in my country, we are for the first time having a corruption following all governments before, in order they recognize and they are guilty and not being completely sure, and we have less money and less support. So this is my only answer. Sorry.
Thank you.
I don't know.
Thank you, Mabel. We have already overshot the time by almost half an hour. So we'll not take up any more questions, but the conversation continues. Conversation does not end here, but we come to the close of today's session. Huge thanks to our speakers for their inspiring talks, and thanks to our participants for their active participation. I would once again remind our media participants to apply for the She and Rights Media Awards, the link for which has been shared in the chat box. And I would like to end with the note that to advance gender equality, governments need to have the political will to improve the sexual and reproductive health and rights of women and girls and all gender diverse people, ensuring that adequate financial resources are available for them. And the global financing architecture must be geared towards the realization of a gender-just economy in which financing development will result in equitable outcomes and fair distribution of resources that promote social, economic, and environmental justice, instead of just providing lip service. We do not want any more lip service, but actual action on the ground from governments and agencies like the UN and these conferences like FFT. Namaste and goodbye till we meet again. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.